Then welcome. I don't actually have a introductory slide on who I am, but I'm with the AI and equality community since over 2 years, probably nearly 3 now. And I've just submitted my PhD looking at how can we better involve affected communities towards responsible AI efforts. And I did this in Cambridge, and I'm based in London. So if you're ever around and want to talk about this, just drop me an email. So today we're going to talk about kind of a new training module where we really dive deep into how to empower affected communities of systems. So kind of how to involve them during the development process towards human rights respecting AI systems. If you're familiar with our material, that's really like a core thing, action around which kind of our philosophy evolves. So we're going to talk about 3 key aspects. The first one is to understand what is community engagement, who are affected communities, why do they need to be involved, and why is this central for human rights respecting AI, and how can we do this? Then we kind of look at, okay, what involvements are there? Are they all kind of equally useful for more equitable AI? And what's currently happening in industry? And then we have a last section that looks a little bit on, if you want to do this in practice, where are resources and materials that can help you to do that for your own projects? Let's start with the first one. Okay, so who are the affected communities of an AI system? And they're often also called stakeholders or impacted groups. And you can identify them with exercises that are called stakeholder mapping or analysis. And this can either be done by who's a user or an affected non-user, who's a right holder, so whose rights could be compromised, and who has the duty to make sure that this doesn't happen, so the duty bearer, or by power structures. And a quick example of this is asking questions like, who's going to be the most impacted by the decision to use this hypothetical AI tool? Who benefits from the use of the tool? To what extent are the targeted outcomes intended to benefit your organizations versus this community? This is just like some examples. We talk about some more later, just to give you an idea on how to identify who affected communities of the system might be. So if we look, for example, here at just like an use case example for an AI tool that supports clinicians in the classification of MRI scans. There are kind of obviously the clinician, the person that will use the tool, but then there's also the patient, so the person the tool will be used on. And of course, there are many, many subgroups of patients and their families. So that's a huge group, really diverse group. But there's also the hospital who pays for the tool. There is the IT administrator who needs to implement the tool and observe the data quality and make sure that kind of the tech side of things is going well. Then there's the nurse who might work with a clinician and then work with the output of the tool. But also people like regulators, so the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, which is kind of the agency that tests tools for clinical safety. And this is just an example to show you that it can be really, really complex to identify all the different stakeholder groups. In the context of this presentation, we will mainly look at the people that aren't already in the room. So the people that will be really affected, but don't currently have the power to influence the system. And now we look at the kind of second bit. So why is it beneficial to involve communities that will be affected by a system? You might be really familiar with this if you've been to any other of our sessions. These are kind of the guiding principles of human rights, or the core principles. And you can already see it's not hard to spot. Participation and inclusion is one of the 3 core principles. And because they are interdependent and interrelated, you need to do this to ensure, only if everyone can participate, you can ensure equality and non-discrimination. And you need people to participate and be included to be able to make sure that the rule of law is enacted. We can also approach this question on why is community involvement important from a different angle. For example, currently a lot of all this responsible AI guidance and stuff, they are really promoting that affected communities should be involved during the development process. And in a paper I'm going to talk about really quickly, I asked why are they doing this, basically? Which benefits do they expect from recommending this stakeholder involvement? Then I looked at guidance from different organizations. It was like 30 different ones. These are just some examples. And then I kind of found that they expect to promote 5 key benefits through engaging affected communities. The first one is to rebalance decision power. So to make sure that basically everyone has a voice in deciding both the broader vision of AI, so which systems do we want to build as society and which ones not, but also in like for one specific system, how should that be realized? And kind of going from this idea that's also very much the core of this presentation and generally our philosophy that everyone who's impacted by a system should have a say in whether and how this system is designed and created. Then, of course, the more people that you have involved that know really the context for which the system is developed, the better you will understand the context and the better the system will fit this context. This is really related to improved risk anticipation because especially the people that are currently at risk in this context, the more they are involved, the more they can foresee potential risks that the system might encounter or enhance, really. Of course, the more you involve people and the more people know that someone like them was involved in the process, the more you trust the system. So the public understanding and trust is a big one. And that's also kind of after deployment, so that the public has scrutiny and monitoring because they can be involved even just post-deployment as well. So these are kind of the key benefits that are associated with involving affected communities towards responsible AI efforts. In other words, community engagement is kind of a way to rebalance asymmetries in agency, priorities, and knowledge. And to say that in a graph, basically the power to shape AI without community involvement, it's very much on the side of the creators and not very much on the side of the people that will be affected by the system. And with community involvement, it can look a little bit more like this, but careful, in reality, it's probably more like this. So showing that there's a massive range. And we will talk about this in more detail later in kind of the second key theme of this presentation. Any questions? If not, I'll jump into how do you do this? So how do you harness all these benefits we just talked about? First of all, quickly, what does actually involvement mean? It's also often called engagement. I've already called it engagement. And it can be done with a lot of different methods, which we will also talk in a second about. But what is really interesting is that this can happen at each stage of the AI lifecycle. So in a lot of our other trainings, we talk about this AI lifecycle. And at each of these stages, you can involve communities. So you can involve a community by defining an objective of a system. You can ask them during testing period, is this system transparent to you? You can involve them in a data discovery or afterwards, after it's deployed, you can ask them, that system you're using, does it work for you? So this is all types of stakeholder involvement. And frankly, you should really do stakeholder involvement at each of these stages. Now, if we do stakeholder involvement, it doesn't matter at which of these stages, it always has to go through a specific process. And we will talk about this process now in a lot of detail. So the first thing you need to have is obviously to have as an organization or a person who wants to do stakeholder involvement, you need to have the attitude that says that's a valuable thing to do. Obvious. Then you need to have the resources because if you want to do it, but you can't because you don't have the resources, you will also fail. So you need the resources. And then the third one is you need to decide on the scope of involvement. And I think this is a really, really, really important one that we will go into in a little bit more detail. Because I'd say that kind of the scope of engagement is a really key aspect that distinguishes meaningful engagement from more commercially oriented engagement. And in the second chapter of this talk, we'll talk a lot more about this. But basically, there are different components of scope. There is, when do you start involving? So we looked at this AI lifecycle. And so the question is, what can still be changed? If you only involve people after you deploy the system, obviously you can't change the objective of the system. Well, you can, but it will be expensive. So it doesn't happen that often. The second component is the continuity. So do you just ask them one thing and then never go back to them? Or do you ask them one thing, come back with a solution, get feedback on that, and it's kind of like a continuous two-way conversation. The third part is very obvious, the participants, who is involved and who isn't. And then the level of decision-making agency or empowerment. So participation at first means you do give them a voice, but then you also need to listen. And this is this point of agency. So how much are we willing to listen or follow through in what we learn from this community? We will go into this in a little bit more detail later when we look at different types of engagement. Okay, but this is the scope. So now we've decided when we want to do involvement with who, and then we're looking at how. And this is what I meant earlier with that there are many different methods, and we'll not talk about all the methods now, but I'll give you a few examples, and they all have pros and cons. So let's discuss a few of them. Very classical one is the observation. So this really means you go out on the street and you observe someone who does the thing you want to know more about them. And this is good because you'll see them actually doing this thing. So there is not any bias by them telling you how they do the thing, you just see how they do the thing. But you don't ask them about their inner experiences, and that might actually be really relevant. Then the survey, it's super time efficient, you send it out and then as many people can complete it at the same time. So that's good. But first of all, it's hard to actually make people fill out a survey. And then often response options are quite limited and it's not that flexible. Interviews are great because they explore inner experiences, but they are time intense because you obviously need to take the time to talk to every single person. And they can be biased by self-reporting. Then we have contextual inquiry, which basically is an observation. You observe someone and then afterwards you interview them about what you've seen. So kind of follow-up questions on like, oh, I've seen you do this, why did you do this? And this is really, really great technique, but it requires a high level of access. Like, for example, I did this with air traffic controllers and I observed some, then I could ask them afterwards, but it was really hard to get this access. It took over a year of back and forth with different companies to be allowed in a control room, which is obviously a safety measure and makes a lot of sense, but it can be really hard to get this level of access. Then focus groups. That's basically an interview, but with a lot of people. So you just have a lot of people in the room and then you ask them something and then you make them discuss with each other and then you can kind of learn from many people at the same time. And also it's sometimes interesting to see where people disagree and then discuss on something can be very useful. What can happen though is that really loud people or extroverted people, or if someone very senior is in the room, then other people don't really dare to say anything. Or this person really dominates the talking time, and then it's more like an interview with one person instead of a focus group. Prototype testing. That's basically when you show a first prototype that you have of your system and then get feedback on it. So it's very concrete, but obviously once you have a prototype, people won't say the idea of your whole project is bad. Or they might not dare to say this. So it obviously already limits a little bit on what's on the table in the discussion. Then we have feedback mechanisms via the system interface. That's kind of like, I'm sure you've seen this before, that you have this button that asks, was this result helpful? So I think ChatGPT used to have that at least at some point, or in some customer customer support pages. And this sort of idea is also, it's also stakeholder involvement to some level, right? Because it asks the people that use the system, so the users, is this good? Does this work or does this not work? So that's good because it's very concrete and experience-based, but it's obviously very, very limited, right? I mean, pressing the green or the red button is not as in-depth as this really could be. And then there's public deliberation, which is really where you try to get a really big representative sample of the group that your system will be using, and then it's a really like guided discussion, and it's a lot of work to organize. This happens quite often in the policy space, when new policies are discussed. And it's great, but it's hard to organize, and you need also access to people that might not normally go to these events, and otherwise they get excluded, and then we just entrench existing power structures. And another thing is that findings might be inconvenient. So people, I think, especially when we look in the policy space, this often isn't done because they don't really want to learn what's said. At least that is what someone said that I've recently interviewed who used to do something like this a lot bit. Okay, now we have the know-how, so we chose the method. In general, if there are any questions, just shout them in. I know this is quite a lot, but I hope by guiding through this process, it's always kind of clear where we are. Okay, then we have recruitment. So now you know how you want to involve them. You have decided on the scope, so who to involve, but now we need to recruit them so we actually can involve them. And here it's really important to think about the groups holding less power, because the really powerful people are likely already in the room and have their voices already heard. So it's really important to focus on the other ones. And this is another example of a stakeholder mapping exercise where I think this is quite interesting to ask which groups are the most and least powerful, who has existing influence and who doesn't, but also to generally ask who has the greatest needs in relation to potential benefits or applications of the system. I think this gives quite like a nice idea on who to focus on. I'll talk about where I got this from later, but in the same resource, there's also this quite interesting chart where you look at what are protected characteristics and then what are contextual vulnerability characteristics. So protected characteristics are just generally things that make people more likely to be disadvantaged. And then contextual vulnerability is how these interact with a specific context. So for example, if we look at healthcare, protected characteristics can be gender, race, language, socioeconomic status. And in the context of healthcare, these are really contextual vulnerability characteristics because, for example, there's less health data and research about not cis male patients, or a lower socioeconomic status is correlated with worse health outcomes, or women complaining about pain are not taken as serious. They take longer to be diagnosed with long-term health conditions. And then also a language barrier can be a problem. So you see how these protected characteristics, they play out in a specific context. And exactly people that are affected by this, especially if they're affected by several of them, so intersectionality, these are really the people you should make sure to also include in your system design, right? Because if the system works for them, it very likely works for everyone else. And how do you get access? And that's obviously very, very hard, or can be hard. Not always, but it can be hard. And I call it participation infrastructure, but this is sort of like something that needs to be established at the beginning when you have an idea about a project, where this is like, first of all, it's expectation management. So we want to involve people this way to ask these questions, and this is the expected outcome. Then rewards or financial rewards, just because this is work, this is their people's time and they're spending on this. It doesn't need to be financial, and sometimes it's also great if you develop, for example, for a company, a very custom system for something they need, then this is also a reward for them and they will buy the system. But generally, yeah, also rapport building, trust, this two-way conversation. This is all really important that people are willing to participate. And I think when this is something that is done from the outset of a project, it's actually not that hard. It's really hard to already have a finished system and then ask people to evaluate it, but then you've not had the right approach from the outset anyway. Of course, everything I said is even more true for marginalized or vulnerable groups. There's obviously less trust in institutions. They have less capacity because many of them work several jobs. They don't have kind of the resources to take off a day, travel somewhere for an interview or something. And or if they're vulnerable, they might also have risk of re-traumatization. And what you can do, especially when talking about these groups, I call them hub people. I don't really know what's the formal name, but this is individuals that already know a lot about these groups and their concerns, but they're themselves not as vulnerable. And for example, this can be a charity worker for a domestic violence charity. Like a colleague of mine did research with victims of domestic violence, and they worked a lot with charity workers to not re-traumatize people, but instead to talk to people that have very good relationships and very deep insights into the experience of different people. And then this hub person might go back to the vulnerable group and confirm some things and stuff to make sure that they accurately represent their experience. And obviously, this isn't ever guaranteed. You need a very good hub person to do this, but these hub people exist in most cases. There's normally already someone who is working on a problem or aware of a problem if there is a problem. And if there isn't a problem, you probably don't need to design a system. Okay, so now we have recruited the people. Now we need to establish a shared knowledge base. And I think especially in the AI context, people often think this means they need to understand what AI is, the people I'm interviewing. And while I think this is probably a little bit true, that there needs to be, the hype needs to demystified a little bit, like this is not a killer robot, a little bit more talking about this is something we want to achieve, this is how technology can help us with this, so they understand enough to give you sort of an informed opinion about what you're working on. Well, but normally you talk about their experiences, right? Because their experiences in their they're experts in their lived experience. So most of the time you're not asking them about technical specifics. So it's also really important that you understand their context. Again, the example of the air traffic controllers, I did a 3-day course in air traffic control to even understand what they were talking about. I even did one little sort of fake controlling in the control center. It was very hard, but this was kind of required to understand the very detailed bits of teamwork that are going on there. And so it's not only the people you are talking to having to understand what AI is, because they don't really have to actually. They just need to not be scared about it so they can give you insights. And it's mainly, or definitely also about you understanding their context and their terminology. So the knowledge base basically goes both ways, is my point. Then effective communication. So even if you have a shared knowledge base, it might be that the person says, I hate this. And while this is sort of helpful, it wouldn't be way more helpful to know why they hate something. So this, the actually communicating effectively about the topic, the questions of the stakeholder involvement is important. Interestingly, like I've done a lot of research with people that do stakeholder involvement, and they all say that that bit is actually really quite easy. And here I did, if you can see the kind of the process at the bottom is the exact same process that we're talking about right now. And what I've done here is to look at tools that are there to support people doing stakeholder involvement. And we can see that most of them, like 24 of them, are for exactly this effective communication stage, which is interesting because the people in practice say, this is easy, I don't really need help with this. But I guess from the outside, this is the most obvious part In stakeholder involvement, you talk with someone. So everyone wants to make this bit easier, even though the harder bit is recruiting, getting the right organizational attitude, like the buy-in from the management. Things like this are way harder in practice than actually just talking to the people. So now you talk to them, you learn something, now you need to store it. It's quite boring, but it's really important because if you don't store it, it gets lost. And you need to store it to then communicate it to colleagues, to have sort of a repository where people can look up, what do we know about this? So there are also not duplicated efforts. And here's like a quick, I'm not saying this is the gold standard at all, but this is like a proposed structure on how something like this could look like, where you kind of say, who did you involve? Why did you involve them? What did you learn about? And how did you incorporate this? And I think templates like this can be helpful to just make sure that people actually think about, why did I involve them? What did I learn? And now what do I do with this? And then having to justify why they react or don't react to it. Or what are next steps. And only now we prioritize these insights, and then we inform stakeholders. So basically, we have communicated it to colleagues, we know about it now. Now we need to say, okay, we learned different things from different stakeholders. Some people in the company have their own idea of what they want to do. How can we prioritize these different things? And interestingly, only here is an impact on the system. Only if what we've learned in this whole process does get prioritized, only then it gets implemented in the system, or in the system impacts the system design. And this is important because this means we need to go through this whole process, and only if we do this fairly successfully, then we can impact the system. And I think what happens in practice a lot is basically after effective communication, or maybe this stuff gets stored, maybe it even gets talked to colleagues, but on the prioritization stage, it really often fails. As soon as stuff is in conflict with commercial interests in practice, the process breaks. Okay. We talk about this a lot more in the next chapter, which we nearly start, but quickly, informing stakeholders is also really important. That's what I meant with this two-way conversation, because you now learn something from them, you do or don't prioritize this, but then you need to tell them, what did you do with what we've learned from them? This is just respect, but also will motivate them to get engaged again, to see that they had impact, or to see, even if they didn't have impact, but they know why they couldn't be prioritized, and there is a legitimate reason, is also fine. Okay, that's the process of involvement. Questions again, just shout out. So first chapter done. That was by far the longest and most complicated one. I'm sorry for this. Let's now look at what different types of engagements are there. And, well, are all of them similarly useful for more equitable AI systems? And the short answer is no. If you want a little bit more nuance on this, then let's look at the Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation. That's like an old thing that has nothing to do with AI, but it's quite useful when thinking about participatory AI. And basically what it says, there is like non-participation. So if you manipulate someone, so they think they participated, but actually you've just made them think that this is something they want, then this is fake. Then there's consult, which is basically you, for example, observe someone, then retrieve it. Actually, I'm not going into too much detail here. I'll do this in a second. So there's fake involvement, there's consulting, including, collaboration, own. And now let's go through the examples. Fake, I don't need to give examples, it's just not participation. Consult is, for example, you observe someone or you do a contextual inquiry, but this means you don't tell them anything about your objectives, you just observe what they do, extract information from them, and then do with it what you want. And in include, we're going a little bit more towards real participation, where we show, for example, a prototype. So the people that you involve have a bit of an idea of what you're doing, and then you get feedback on this. And then the next stage is collaborate. I have an example here, an example study just quickly, because I think it's quite a good one. And what they've done is they collaboratively developed an AI model with all impacted stakeholder groups. It was quite like a confined environment, so this was possible. And what they've done is that basically system stakeholders could say which factors for them are most important in a decision and how would they rank them, like what's the most important one, what's the second most important one. And so they kind of trained their own model by telling their preferences on an interface. And then there was kind of like a model for each person's preferences. Then they aggregated these models and then they saw conflicts. And then there were, I think, 3 or 4 workshops where they invited all people with conflicts and then they discussed sort of these conflicts and resolved them. And the resulting system and also how the process of how it was created was really considered extremely fair by all stakeholder groups, and it worked way better than the process they had before. So this is a great example on how this was really collaboratively. And then own, kind of the last bit, this is really like a community goes to technical people and says, we want this. And then the technical people kind of, or AI creators, kind of work in service of this community. And because I love this so much, we're going to look at this again. We ignore fake now, we just look at the top 4 ones. And so there are these different modes of participation. Again, what we just discussed: consult, include, collaborate, own. And I think what is really important or interesting here is now to look at the dimensions of participation. So what's the goal? So why do we need participation? The scope, which is what's on the table and who is involved. We talked about this a little bit earlier as well. So when do you start the involvement? Who do you include? And then there's the form. What form does the stakeholder participation take? And if we look at this now, maybe let's compare consult and own. So the goal of participation by consulting is to improve the user experience. But if you go towards own, it's to shape the system's scope and purpose. So way more powerful, right? You give way more agency or empowerment to the people that are involved. Then if we look at the scope, so what's on the table? In consult, it's the interface, but in own, it's whether and why the system should be built. Again, way more powerful. Who is involved? The stakeholders are recruited by the project team for discrete feedback. So they decide when they want feedback and from whom. By own, this is the community that will be affected by the system designates stakeholders, and they then play a central role across the entire project. And the form of participation is also really interesting because it's basically who decides or what type of participation is happening. And in consult, this is basically the people give input on design ideas in very like confined moments. But if we look at own, this is basically the community is deciding on how they want to be involved, what they think is their best way to participate. So I think these are quite nice examples to really see this dimension. And it's obviously not always, sometimes something is between collaborate and own or between include and collaborate. So this is not like extremely distinct categories, it's more like dimensions. But it gives sort of an idea on how, well, participation or community involvement isn't always the same. There are very different types of it. And then one more thing, because it wasn't complicated enough, really empowering all groups isn't always possible, right? That's like some contexts have contextual constraints or different people want different things, so you can't empower everyone. For example, if we look in safety critical contexts, like in air traffic control, for example, some people might want, oh, I really hate this button there, or I really hate the security question all the time, it's like annoying. But in this context, safety is the thing that needs to be prioritized, even if some stakeholders are like, I understand that safety needs to be prioritized, but I still think this button is annoying. So it's really important to first explore the needs of a broad range of stakeholders, and to then prioritize them based on the contextual constraints. So for example, in a safety critical environment, look at all the needs that were related to safety need to come first. This is just like a little nuance I want to add, because I think this is something that, especially in this discussion where everyone always says more and more empowerment, and I agree, more and more empowerment is great, just sometimes it's, for example, not safe. Yeah. Okay. Then let's look what's happening in industry. And there I did a little study where I did first a survey, and then I talked to some people that filled out the survey. And they were all people that were involved in the development of or creation of AI systems. And a lot of them were technical or product, user experience, research. So quite a broad range of roles in this process. Basically, what I found is that these AI practitioners, that's how I call them, people involved in creating AI, they mainly reported that they did stakeholder involvement for commercial interests. Some example quotes are, well, we did it to ensure that the client got something that was meeting their needs fully. We did it to identify product market fit. We did it to engage buyers to make sure that the same things you're trying to solve, they value as a pain and will actually sign off on buying. So basically, if someone says, this is a problem that I encounter, then we at first check if someone would pay for us solving the problem, basically, is what that means. So this is obviously a problem, because then we look at usability and customer value. We're not looking at rebalancing decision power. And yeah, especially stuff that was more related to human rights aligned AI development wasn't mentioned, or in the survey it was like not selected or really low priority. And obviously this really impacts the type of engagement. So most involved groups were typical end users, domain experts, and internal legal team. So again, linked to commercial or legal interests. So not getting sued was also an interest. And who wasn't involved was the general public, affected non-users, and also users that weren't sort of the typical users, so atypical users, more in the margins. They were also not involved. And that was interesting because over 30% said for each of these three groups said that they think their system will affect them, but they couldn't be asked basically to involve them. Yeah, that was just always a low priority. And yeah, main methods again was prototype testing or usability tests, which means you can only do this when you already have a prototype, or like the objective is defined. It's very far down the AI lifecycle. So then they cannot really change the objective anymore because there's already a prototype, which basically means there's low decision agency. Because even people that did involve people said it's hard to make them, and in this case this was their management, stick to what you think would be good for the stakeholder. So there were also a lot of people working in these companies that really wanted to fight for the stakeholders' needs, but they were kind of torn between what their job required and what they wanted to do. So how their management would reward them and what they think would be right. And that's, yeah, there was actually a lot of frustration as well around this. Okay, so if we now look into this, this is clearly consult. Like there's no own happening at all. Not even really include. So this is also something that, yeah, basically so far we are only really seeing consult in industry. Very rarely any other things. So yeah, it's about advancing commercial interests right now, and especially if community needs are in conflict with business interests, they are kind of sacrificed. That's obviously sad, but to make that better going forward, we'll now talk about tools and resources that can help you in doing it better. Because obviously I've now talked quite a while, but there is a lot of resources and more detail there that can help you to really find this type of stakeholder involvement that's good for your project. So there's one from IDEO, which is not AI specific, but I think it's really good if you want to get more familiar with stakeholder involvement and how you can do this. This is a really good playbook. It looks fun. It's fun to read. Very nicely illustrated. That's, I think, a really good one to learn a little bit more about. Again, the process, principles. How can you put this into practice? Then there is, I actually don't know how to pronounce this, but from this lab, they have a website which I really like because it starts with problems. It's again not AI specific, but it's technology specific. And it is for people that are designing or creating technology. And it's goal based, which I really like. It's basically you can select a goal. So here I want to identify appropriate values to drive my design work, or I want to apply specific values in my design work. And then you can press on it, and then it suggests you different methods to achieve this goal, which is great. And it's very, very, a lot of it is with participation, most of it. And then I would have for each, for example, here, now we would have clicked on the method empathetic walkthrough. Then it would tell you if it's easy or hard, how many people do you need, where's more reading. It's just quite nice to get an overview over a lot of methods quite quickly. Then this is from some research I've done, and I think it's probably more on the scientific, harder to digest side of things. But basically, when we looked at this process earlier, that's in the top right now, then we can basically look at this here at the process stage. And then we can see, okay, which of these stages each of these tools addresses. So you can basically filter by a specific process stage, and then you can see tools that are kind of useful to support you at this stage. There is a QR code to the spreadsheet. Yes. And then, so if you are operating in a really like a high risk domain where you really want to make sure you do it really in depth, then there is the Human Rights, Democracy, and the Rule of Law Assurance Framework for AI Systems. It's really good. It's from the Alan Turing Institute. We also had a little bit of input in this, and they worked on this with the Council of Europe. And there is a really big part of this is about the stakeholder engagement process. And there they have a really in-depth this mapping exercise that we talked about, then a positionality reflection, which basically means that you think about who you are means which perspective you have on the problem and how you can get a more diverse perspective. Then how you can decide on your engagement objectives. So why are you engaging? And then how to do this. And then also to go back to this workflow and ask the people that you're involving about what they think about your plan of involvement. So this really brings you way further towards the own bit. It's not quite own, but it does ask all the right questions that can really help you to shift towards this side. Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much. If there's any questions, feel free to email me. I'm happy to have a specific chat as well about projects or anything. Like if you want to know what to do for a specific project. Thank you.